Okay, welcome everybody. It's exciting to be here with you as Mercury right now, as well as Venus is stationing. So we are, and actually earlier today, Mars entered Pisces, and the lunar nodes are changing signs. So both, I think the mean lunar nodes calculation changed today. So the lunar nodes have changed signs. Mars has entered Pisces. Venus is finally stationing direct in Libra right now, and then Mercury is likewise stationing. But the difference is Mercury is stationing retrograde in Sagittarius. So this Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius is going to actually take us all the way back into Scorpio and then come forward again. The span of the actual retrograde is from November 16th to December 6th. But I'll also kind of talk about how this fits into the larger picture of everything. As you know, we've been going through a very long Venus retrograde. It's usually about 40 days. It was back on October 5th that Venus stationed retrograde. And so we're finally at the end of that right now. And so what's interesting is just as Venus stations direct, Mercury stations retrograde. And additionally to this, Venus is in this opposition right now with Uranus and Aries, which is basically going through the rest of the month of November. And so there's a very interesting thing where even though Venus retrograde is pretty much over right now, us coming out of it, entering this Mercury retrograde and Sag and Scorpio, is sort of like the final part of the story. And so even though I'm going to be primarily talking about Mercury retrograde tonight, all of this you really want to fit in the larger picture of Venus retrograde just ending, and we're finally coming out of Venus retrograde, but we're entering not really into clear sailing, so to speak. We're entering into this other liminal phase. Both Mercury and Venus retrogrades are both liminal phases that we go through where you're not the same when you come out as when you entered. And so we're gonna talk about that tonight. This is a quote from Carl Karenyi in his book, Hermes Guide of Souls, which is one of the best books, in my opinion, about the mythic Mercury or Hermes. And I think it's a great quote just to sum up a very good attitude to take into Mercury retrograde, especially a Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. Whoever does not shy away from the dangers of the most profound depths and the newest pathways, which Hermes is always prepared to open, may follow him and reach a greater find and a more certain possession. For all to whom life is an adventure, whether an adventure of love or of spirit, Hermes is a common guide. So Mercury, if you don't know, back in ancient Hellenistic time, beginning of astrology, it was a Greek language. So it was actually called the Star of Hermes. And there's a way in modern astrology where it's very common to link Mercury up with things like categorizing things. And sometimes you hear people talk a lot about the sort of rational, linear thinking and analysis. As we know, Mercury is also connected with commerce, with wide changes in fortune, any kind of mercantile activity. Mercury is also connected with travel, as well as technology. Travel in part because of how fast it travels. And most often talked about, Mercury is about interpreting, translating, discerning, conveying meaning and understanding. It sort of mediates in between the sun and the moon. And basically, being the planet closest to the sun is this planet that's all about how we communicate, how we think, how we perceive, how we interpret and translate meaning and understanding. So that doesn't even have to be verbal. You could be doing nonverbal things mercurially. The thing is, though, that this idea of Mercury being rational and linear is really just part of the picture of what Mercury does. And a lot of times we hear, especially in pop astrology, Mercury retrograde treated like this accursed abomination, that we're just cursed, we're all screwed because Mercury's retrograde. Everything that goes wrong, you're supposed to blame on Mercury retrograde. You'll hear some people talk about, don't start anything, don't sign a contract during Mercury retrograde. And none of that is really true. There's countless examples of all kinds of successful things people start and sign contracts and make purchases during Mercury retrograde. One thing you can think about, though, just keeping in mind sort of electional astrology, is they may have a bit of a Mercury retrograde type of quality to them going forward, and be even sort of activated at times during other Mercury retrogrades. But you can definitely do successful things during it. This idea that Mercury is also connected to boundaries, thresholds. Hermes was a god of the crossroads. Hermes and Mercury, they didn't really have temples erected. It was at crossroads and stacking up these stones like Hermes, being a guide of travelers. Also this idea of liminal states, as well as being a psychopomp guide of soul. Hermes and Mercury was the god that could go down to the underworld and come back to the upper world. And this idea of crossing realms like that, being able to go under the underworld, come back to the overworld, it's not unlike the idea of being able to go into your unconscious and back to the conscious, and shifting in between these different realms. And that can also go for the rational as well as the irrational, the linear and the non-linear. And because Mercury moves so quickly, one of the things it really does with its transits is it really creates these boundaries and these thresholds we cross into. And when Mercury is stationing, just like it is right now, and this is even a sort of a more electric atmosphere right now as I'm talking, because again, we also have Venus also stationing at the same time. But when Mercury is stationing as it is right now, we're crossing a threshold. It's always really important when Mercury is stationing to just be hyper aware. I mean, obviously, you want to be going about your life with as much awareness moment to moment as possible. Sometimes people are a little bit more habitual, just kind of going through the motions. Mercury stationing is definitely a time to avoid that, and really just be paying attention to all the signs going on around you. Yes, oftentimes during Mercury retrograde, things might break down or not start working, but whatever starts not working or wherever you're guided with your attention during Mercury retrograde, it's for a reason. And you can think about Hermes as this guide, guiding you and your awareness into what you need to pay attention, what really needs your focus. It may not be what you think it was going into it. So you do need to be prepared to kind of shift and change. Mercury is, of course, the planet closest to the sun. The moon being the light that orbits us in astrology is really the thing that moves the fastest. But Mercury is the fastest moving planet. And Mercury's speed, really changes. At parts of its phase, it's moving very quickly, kind of a couple degrees a day. Other times, it's not even moving. And that is what we're going on is right now, is that it's literally just standing still. This quick movement of Mercury is part of the reason it's seen as such a protean, changeable, volatile energy and planet to pay attention to in astrology. Mercury goes retrograde really at least 3 times every year. It spends a lot of its time in retrograde motion out of its entire synodic cycle. We can see Mercury at points as an evening star or as a morning star, but it's only ever at twilight. And it tends to be a much more fleeting glance. Mercury is not as visible, as bright and as long as Venus, for example. Right now, Mercury is visible as an evening star, and we'll talk about this a little bit more going forward. What happens is Mercury at this point is standing still by zodiacal motion. It's still visible as an evening star, but wouldn't be very visible very long after sunset. and then it basically starts descending and becoming invisible. And this is when we shift into what we could call an underworld phase. So, in astrology, we have this idea of, what's above is like what's below, or what's below is like above. Mercury, with its movement like that, going up and down, changing speeds, Mercury is a planet that rules astrology traditionally. And, that's one of the things you can really think about, how Mercury taps us into it. Mercury is exalted in Virgo, as well as having its home in Virgo. That's an interesting thing to think about, just as far as the meaning of Mercury, because in the northern hemisphere, of course, that's the time period where it's the end of summer and we're turning toward the darkness of autumn. And of course, at the autumn equinox, we enter Libra, and Libra is the exaltation of Saturn. It's known as the fall of the sun because of, the light starts decreasing then. We start going into this darker time. Mercury's very symbol also has this idea of uniting light and dark. It has the crescent of soul, the circle of spirit, and the cross of matter. All of those are within its symbol. And that's really just a fundamental meaning of Mercury. More than anything else in astrology, it's a planet that bridges and integrates and unites soul and spirit and matter. So even though Mercury has a very different meaning and speed than Saturn, they're both really guardians of thresholds, because Saturn is it's the farthest out planet that we can see. If we're using traditional rulerships, it's the farthest out planet. Beyond Saturn is everything like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Eris, and everything else. So the difference is Saturn is very slow. So we have these very slow, long Saturn transits, whereas Mercury is really changing speeds a lot. But similarly to Saturn, it really pulls us into the material world at times. It can, we talk about Saturn transits sometimes being difficult and presenting a challenge. Mercury retrograde periods can also, do that as well and be a challenging sort of testing of whatever's going on in the material realm. It's all about bridging polarities. So these ideas of day, night, male, female, benefic, malefic, these are all traditional polarities within astrology. Astrology is really built on polarities, and Mercury is the one planet that bridges all of these things. Every other planet is said to be a day planet or a night planet. Mercury is the only one that is both a day planet and a night planet. In a lot of ways, you could say it's sort of a twilight planet. Other planets are given male or female genders. You could also think about this as being yin, yang. It's actually the same thing as day, night, basically. Mercury doesn't have any gender. It can be either one. Mercury is not considered a benefic or a malefic. What it does, though, is it really will strongly take on the characteristics of the other planets it's around, the other planets it's in aspect to. And so that's really interesting, as we'll talk about with this current Mercury retrograde, because it's in Sagittarius, Jupiter's in Sagittarius, there's this big thing going on with Neptune. So we have a lot of like Jupiter, Neptune, Pisces, Sagittarius things going on with this particular Mercury retrograde we're going into. You can also think about not just the polarities within astrology, but just all polarities in general, such as the sacred and the mundane, the spiritual material, all of these things. Mercury is something that unifies the polarities and really takes us into both. So it really shows us what's sacred about the mundane, what's mundane about the sacred. It's something that does tap us into the unconscious and helping us gain some of that awareness of that sort of fertile, unconscious energy within us into our conscious awareness. This is another quote from Carl Karenyi in that book that I really love, that goes into this idea of how Mercury is this mediating, bridging in between archetype. he's basically describing here when he's saying the soul realm, he's describing sort of the archetypal realm of Mercury and Hermes. It is a soul realm as a primordial foundation of all actualizations in life, a middle realm between being and non-being. The primordial mediator and messenger moves between the absolute no and the absolute yes, or more correctly, between two no's that are lined up against each other, between two enemies, between woman and man. In this he stands on ground that is no ground, and there he creates the way. From out of a trackless world, unrestricted, flowing, ghost-like, he conjures up the new creation. And this sort of meaning that you can see in this quote is really something to think about, this idea of this trackless world, something sort of unrestricted, flowing, ghost-like that's going to conjure up this new creation. If you really embrace what's happening during Mercury retrograde time periods, this is a sort of thing that can happen coming out of it on the other side. Sorry, I have to, okay. So this one is in Sagittarius. So Mercury in Sagittarius is actually a very inspiring, kind of exciting Mercury retrograde to go into. Certainly there may be some challenging events on the global stage with current events that end up happening with this. But Sagittarius is a fast-moving, it's a fiery sign. It's a sign that's ruled by Jupiter. So Sagittarius is the fiery home of Jupiter. It's the outward, projecting outward Jupiter sign. It's the fiery Jupiter sign. So it's a sign that is very much tapped into spirit, connecting with spirit. Very enthusiastic, very into underlying philosophy and tapping into the sort of mythic meaning of everything going on. When Mercury is in Sagittarius, what's interesting about this placement is it's the opposite sign of Gemini. So Gemini is Mercury's home, where it rules and it's very comfortable. Gemini is an air sign. Sagittarius is the opposite sign. So whenever Mercury is in Sagittarius, you always need to figure out, where is Jupiter? Because when Mercury is in Sagittarius, it is going to be ruled by Jupiter. One of the things that's exciting to me about this Mercury retrograde is that Jupiter is now in Sagittarius. Jupiter just entered Sagittarius last week. So we're still really adjusting and attuning to the Jupiter and Sagittarius energy and how it's going to correspond with our life. And right away, just as Jupiter goes into Sagittarius, like I said, Mars enters Pisces, which is another Jupiter sign today. Venus is stationing direct. Now we get Mercury going retrograde in Sagittarius. Because Jupiter is also in Sagittarius at the same time that Mercury retrograde is in Sagittarius, that is a very strong mitigating positive aspect of this, because Jupiter is home, Jupiter is present. Mercury is going through this retrograde process. You could kind of think of Mercury's going through this whole process in the home of Jupiter, and Jupiter's there. Jupiter's present in the same place, in the same land. Jupiter's there and able to give Mercury all of this. You could think about like philosophy, knowledge, mythical understanding, mythology, this enthusiastic eagerness to explore subject matters, even other cultures. Sagittarius is very much a traveling, fast-moving type of sign. So Mercury and Jupiter, traditionally in astrology, those are polarities. Just like the Sun and Saturn are considered polarities, and the Moon and Saturn are considered polarities, and Venus and Mars are considered polarities. So are Mercury and Jupiter. So what we have here is again an opportunity to work with polarities, and that's what Mercury is all about. And Mercury retrogrades are also all about, unifying these polarities. So there's something really interesting to discover about this Mercury retrograde process, because this is all happening, as we'll talk about here in a moment, also involving Neptune. It's sort of like we, right off the bat of this Jupiter and Sagittarius transit we're going to experience for the next year, we're really getting this kind of like deeper probing into, perhaps, what sort of illusions, what sort of things about our beliefs and our philosophy of life and our vision of life are, not really working for us anymore, or not really attuned to what's really happening. There's some sort of shedding about that needs to happen at the beginning of this transit of Jupiter and Sagittarius. This is a graphic just of what the Mercury synodic cycle looks like. So in case you're not aware, where we are right now is what's at the bottom of this image, where it says Mercury. You can see it says Mercury retrograde, inferior conjunction. You can see the planet Earth. So because Mercury orbits in between Earth and the Sun, Mercury actually ends up, just like Venus, making two conjunctions with the Sun. When it's in between our orbit and the Sun, that is when it's retrograde, and that's called the inferior conjunction. We're not there yet, but we'll be there in a few weeks. It happens on November 27th. There's another conjunction that happens between Mercury and the Sun called the superior conjunction. That's when Mercury is moving direct and conjoins the Sun. The last time we had that was just before the recent equinox. It was around, I think, September 20th. It was in Virgo. The last time we had a Mercury retrograde inferior conjunction conjunct the Sun, like we're going to in a few weeks, that was actually back in August. And that happened in Leo. That happened back, if you remember that Leo solar eclipse that happened back then, and Mars was retrograde. This is back at the beginning of August. That was the last time we had a Mercury retrograde inferior conjunction. So what's going on during the Mercury retrograde is it's moving from an evening star to eventually becoming a morning star. When Mercury stations retrograde, it's an evening star. Then once it gets within this 15-degree range between the Mercury and the Sun, this will happen kind of like next Monday or Tuesday. I think it happens around like the 19th, 18th of November. That's when Mercury disappears and we can't see it anymore. This 15-degree boundary is just used in astrology as being, if a planet's within 15 degrees of the Sun, it's considered under the beams of the Sun, and it's sort of experiencing a purification because it's approaching the Sun. We can't see it anymore. When it unites with the Sun, it undergoes a purification. Interestingly, Jupiter is also going through that right now. In actuality, Mercury and Venus can be seen within 15 degrees, but it's just a marker that's just used traditionally, and it really does work in practice pretty well, just to use that 15-degree marker. And not otherwise, you can also obviously always look up the astronomical data about when Mercury will actually be visible and disappear. But what ends up happening is we had a few back at the we had a recent Scorpio new moon back at the beginning of November. Around that time, like November 6th or so, that was when Mercury was at maximum elongation as an evening star. So it was kind of up as high as it gets as an evening star. And then what happens is it starts going down lower each night. And right now it's not moving by zodiacal degree, and it's still visible as an evening star, but it's getting lower and lower. And the next few nights going forward, it's gonna be getting lower and lower until we can't see it anymore. And then it will disappear until it ends up getting 15 degrees behind the Sun. When that happens, and this will be more like in, I think, December, early December, it'll become visible again as a morning star. So basically, it's an evening star, it disappears, and then it comes up again before the Sun rises, and it transitions into being a morning star. The 3 points of those inferior conjunctions each year, and a very interesting thing about this is that Mercury ends up, its synodic cycle ends up creating a 6-pointed star Sometimes you hear that called like a Star of David. They're not always in the same element, but generally speaking, for the most part, the 3 Mercury retrogrades each year, the inferior conjunctions, tend to be in the same element. So this past year, we've had a fire year. If you remember back in March, we had a Mercury retrograde in Aries. Back in August, we had a Mercury retrograde in Leo. Now we have a Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. Next year, we are actually going to be transitioning into a water year, and we're going to have Mercury retrogrades in Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio. When we have these happening in the inferior conjunction in one element, the superior conjunctions tend to be in the element of the same sect. So fire and air signs are both day, outward, yang signs. So this year we've been having superior conjunctions in air signs. We had one in Gemini. We're going to end up, the next one is actually in Aquarius after this. It doesn't always match up because we had one in Virgo. So this doesn't always exactly line up. But the point is we tend to have this happen. And what's interesting about the Star of David shape, of course, is we have this downward pointing triangle, which is sort of like this descent down into soul. And we also have an ascending in soul and kind of the material world, you could say. And we have this upward pointing triangle that is sort of like this ascent up to spirit. And of course, Mercury bridges these things two together. So it's a very fitting symbol to its synodic cycle. You're probably familiar that the Venus synodic cycle that we're just finishing right now, as far as the retrograde, the Venus forms a 5-pointed star. Mercury similarly forms this 6-pointed star. And so here you can see how, if you looked at that upward pointing triangle, we can see it connects to Sagittarius, Aries, Leo. This is saying superior conjunctions. This year we've been having an inferior conjunction, but you can see how when it's connecting to the same elements like that, it ends up forming that 6-pointed star. This, that idea of the elemental year is talked about a lot in this book by Gary Caton. If you're interested in this material, this is the best book that's currently out there on the subject. Gary Caton does a really great job writing about Mercury, and he connects it very strongly to alchemy. And a very interesting thing that ends up happening, in addition to that thing about Mercury, is happening in the same element, when we have the maximum elongation as an evening star, and then later we have the inferior conjunction when Mercury is retrograde, and then we have a maximum elongation as a morning star on the other side of the whole process. These 3 things tend to happen in a very similar, close degree range. So just to show you an example, like as I mentioned, Mercury was at maximum elongation as an evening star back on November 6th. That was at like 8 degrees of Sagittarius. Then later, November 27th, we're going to get the inferior conjunction. That's going to be at about 6 degrees of Sagittarius. And then later, after Mercury is visible again as a morning star, it'll reach maximum elongation as a morning star in mid-December on December 15th at 3 degrees of Sagittarius. So you can see how those are all kind of the same thing. What's really interesting, we get this above as an evening star, it then disappears at that middle one, and then it comes up again in the morning before the sun rises. What Gary Caton does in this book, and I don't have time to go through describing all of this, but if you're familiar with alchemy, you can apply that meaning to this. I'll talk about a little bit here, but it's, I could do my whole talk today just on this, so I'm just kind of mentioning it. He really links up the phase that we're in right now with the Negretto phase. So if you're familiar with that, that's like the blackening, putrefaction type of phase in alchemy where things are really breaking down. One of the key things with alchemy is that things kind of break down, break apart, and then they end up coming back together again. So it's like, so sort of like breaking down, things breaking apart, and then things coming together again, and they're coming together again in something new. Whereas with, Mercury, we're in a lot of ways, we're really talking about our consciousness. So this phase we're in now, all the way up until the inferior conjunction. So from now all the way going up to about November 27th, this is a phase of the Mercury retrograde where things are kind of really breaking down. And you can really actively engage with this, especially because it's in a fire sign like Sagittarius. You can even kind of think about like this idea of, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's kind of colder now. You know, a lot of times people light a fire. This idea of like the fire, like burning up things. Maybe there's things you're just ready to get rid of, and you're kind of throwing it into the fire. And your fire is a very transformative, volatile energy. So whatever is going on with, you know, the way you think about things that are ready to be letting go, you're really actively engage in that now. Sometimes in our life, we also notice there's elements of our life that just aren't working the way we were expecting them to. We might have to focus and fix something or repair something, or our attention might get drawn into some kind of dynamic that we really have to focus on, whatever that may be. And that's important to be paying attention to during this part. Then we reach the inferior conjunction, which we'll talk more about. That's like the albedo phase. That's a real purifying phase. In a way you could think about it as like a sacred marriage, even this idea of the unconscious and conscious, spirit, matter, spirit, soul, all coming together. This is basically going from the inferior conjunction through to the end of the Mercury retrograde, and then Mercury becoming a morning star again. And so this part is really something just to kind of like let yourself go with, you know, what's ready to start coming out. And it's not going to necessarily be clear right away. You know, it's sort of like a birthing process of this new awareness. And then when we hit the last part, December 15th, at this point, Mercury will be direct and moving forward again. It's going to be a morning star. And at this point, it's a time, like the rubedo phase of whatever this new consciousness or awareness is that you've been working on. This is a time to really kind of seize that and try to really bring it into your daily life, and not just have it been this like passing thing that you just go back to the way things were again, that instead you actually, you know, seize it and use it to really seed your life and change your life in this new direction of whatever, you know, was ready to emerge out of this Mercury retrograde process. When Mercury shifts retrograde like it is right now, and it's like it's going into the underworld. And we can think about that as Mercury becoming a psychopomp, going, and, you know, Mercury is a psychopomp and a guide of souls. In myth, Mercury would go into the underworld and help souls transition into the afterlife. What that ends up kind of seeming a lot to me, if you see that those images I just had on that last slide, it's this chiaroscuro painting technique, which is this painting is another example of that. Chiaroscuro, you also see that a lot like in cinematography and photography. It's really high contrasts of light and shadow. And I think it's a very good metaphor for Mercury retrograde perception. Mercury retrograde is much more of an intuitive sort of perception. It's a time to really be paying attention to the signs and omens happening around you, what might be happening in your dream life. And the way that you can kind of see in these techniques of painting where there's like this dark and there's like this light, a lot of times our focus gets really focused into like something, and instead of being kind of aware of everything going on all at once, it's a lot better as a very powerful energy to really focus in on something. If you remember that previous slide, Mercury is in between us and the sun right now. Mercury is as close to us as it ever gets right now. And Mercury retrograde is going to be really powerful if you have something you want to research, you have some kind of research project or musical artistic project, any kind of creative project, and something you just really want to focus in on and just go into the depths with it. Mercury retrograde can be very, very powerful for that. So this is the chart for tomorrow when Mercury is actually stationing retrograde. So you can see Mercury is stationing retrograde at 13 degrees, 29 minutes of Sagittarius. So one thing just to think about is, you know, what house do you have Sagittarius? What house is that in your chart? Do you have anything around 14, 13 degrees of Sagittarius. But you can also, of course, think about, if you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of Sagittarius, but if you have a lot of Virgo or Gemini or Pisces, these mutable signs are very, very active during this retrograde. You can see right when Mercury is going retrograde, Jupiter is already at 2 degrees of Sagittarius. If you look down at the bottom there of the chart in Pisces, you can see that Neptune is at 13 degrees and 42 minutes. So Mercury is basically stationing, squaring Neptune. And very interestingly, when it does this, the moon is coming in to conjoin Neptune. So because the moon is getting involved there, it's really like the moon is really getting in and mixing all this up. It's really bringing this down very strongly into our perceptions tomorrow. Likewise with Mars, just at the beginning of Pisces, you can see we also have a very close Mars-Jupiter square. And I know a lot of you that are in this meeting would maybe think about Neptune ruling Pisces, but it's important to remember that Jupiter traditionally rules Pisces. And so Jupiter is actually receiving all that Pisces energy into itself in Sagittarius. There's actually, that really kind of mitigates, it's not going to make this an easy thing, but it does, it does heighten the potential of getting something out of it. So for example, we can imagine very easily the strong Sagittarius Pisces clash happening as being about disillusioning experiences. Disillusionment is really important because it makes you aware of what's actually going on. It may not be fun to go through disillusionment, but it helps reorient you to the truth of your life. That's something that's, you're going to be better off in the long run for having that happen. And again, because it is happening the exact same day that Venus is stationing, opposite Uranus, with Venus and Uranus squaring the lunar nodes at the same time, it's just very, very powerful energy. And I would just, again, it's the best advice I have is just, really letting yourself pay attention to what's going on. There's a lot of potentially good things that could come out of this. And there's also a lot of potentially difficult things you might discover about yourself and your the important relationships in your life. But that's going to probably, even if it's difficult, it's probably going to be really important information that in the end you really did need to know, and you need to face, and you need to work with it. So because Neptune is really strongly involved, that's one of the things to really think about this Mercury retrograde. We can think about Neptune and Pisces as being about these sort of like ultimate ideals, this ultimate imaginal fantasy vision of really what we want to have happen, who we want to be, who we want to embody. And because of this square going on with the Sagittarius, it's going to be really important to think about focusing on really, creating life from that imaginal place, because there is a deeper imaginal truth that we can associate with Neptune and Pisces that this Mercury retrograde can help us tap into. At the same time, there can be an illusion, delusion, aspect of Neptune and Pisces that we might be operating from. And the difficult thing, of course, is that when we're operating from that place, it's hard for us to know. You don't realize when you're caught up in an illusion or something, some sort of delusive belief, you're not aware of it until you're made to be aware of it, and you get that kind of bubble popped. So that's the type of thing that could certainly be happening. We have a very powerful transit that we're just now entering, where we have Saturn in Capricorn, as well as Jupiter in Sagittarius. Both Saturn and Jupiter are in their home signs right now. So the way that we can work with this, with all of this, is just to think about, Saturn and Capricorn. One thing that's really good is having boundaries and really facing the reality of a situation. And so the more we can do that, instead of getting caught up, because a lot of times with these illusions we end up projecting them into our relationships and our perceptions, and we think things are going on that aren't necessarily really going on. And the other thing, though, is Saturn in Capricorn can also be, you know, a bit of an overly harsh, melancholic. You know, melancholy is great for imagination, but it can also be a little hard type of energy. Jupiter in Sagittarius is really great for just having this optimistic outlook, just having this faith and this vision that we can get through this period, and that this this ideal imaginal image or whatever we really want to, this dream we have of what we want to create or be, is possible, you know, with the, you know, hard work and dedication and those boundaries of the Saturn and Capricorn. Because we're also having Mars and Neptune coming together. So that's the other thing. This whole time, Mercury's going retrograde, Mars is getting closer to Neptune every single day. So we have Mars and Neptune coming together. That can be this amazing energy for imagination, this imaginal creative warrior. It can also, though, be a crusader. Jupiter in Sagittarius can be a crusader. So we can also get that sort of crusader, martyr type of complex, or just somebody very lost and acting out of this this illusion. So there's definitely some difficult, you know, there also could be some deception obviously going on. We got Mercury and Neptune coming together, but the other side is always to keep in mind is that there is that other side of reality that goes beyond Saturn, you know, that goes beyond what you can actually touch with your fingers and hear with your, well, maybe you can hear with your inner ear or your inner sight, but, you know, there's this sort of extra sensory perception of the interconnected underlying fabric of reality, right? And this, how things are connected beyond just like the consensus boundaries and laws of consensus reality. So that type of idea and awareness is very possible to tap into with this current Mercury retrograde, and could be really great for creative work. This is an image called Cracked Ice by artist Mariyama Okyo. I think it was just interesting. I was just thinking about this and just this idea of like there's a sort of like these cracks in the ice. If you kind of think about the beliefs we have about the way the world works and the philosophy we live our life from, and just the way we have in our mind, the way how everything's supposed to be, it can become a very solid thing, you know, and we often even, it can be frozen, right? Like literally like this frozen ice. And because this Mercury retrograde is in a fire sign, there's definitely some, you know, fiery change coming in. And to me, in a way, you can kind of think about just like kind of cracks starting to show up in this view that we've been operating from about reality. And to me, there's actually something important if that's happening. Instead of being negative about it and blaming things on it, instead be curious about that. Let that lead you and guide you to discover what does that really want to show you about the way the world works, and what does that want to reveal to you about the vision for you to be living your life from. Another image, this is actually by another artist who is painting an image of the artist that actually painted that previous image, if that makes any sense. The guy that painted that previous image is there's a story, like as you can tell, he's an amazing artist, and there's a story that he painted a ghost so expertly that it, you know, that it came alive. And so that's what this is an image of. It's an image of an artist, you know, who has created this painting of a spirit or a ghost that's so incredibly powerful imaginally that it's actually taps, you know, it becomes alive and is interacting with them. So that's something else about this. You know, sometimes with Pisces, we talk about escaping reality and addictions and all that sort of thing. But there's another thing when we enter that sort of imaginal world that can open up to us through art, or maybe it's just reading a fantasy book or reading a book or whatever it is. There can be a deeper truth that actually opens up to us through that imaginal experience. Like, for example, I've actually recently been reading the Lord of the Ring books. And if you know those, that's an entire imaginal mythological world that that Tolkien created. And so some of these imaginal worlds that get created, they almost have this, sort of alternate reality where they're, even though you might see, oh, that's not really true, like there's actually some sort of deeper truth revealed to you through them. And that's the kind of thing we're going to see with this, again, all this Neptune, Mars, Pisces, and Jupiter, Mercury retrograde, Sagittarius stuff happening. So the thing that's really remarkable about this Mercury retrograde is that not only is all this other stuff happening that I've already been mentioning, but Mercury is also out of bounds right now. So Mercury went out of bounds on November 30th, and it's only going to be out of bounds, next week it's going to come back within bounds. It'll be out of bounds until November 20th. But what's interesting about that is that's the same time frame of the real intensity of the square between Mercury retrograde and Neptune. If you don't know what out of bounds is, if I can just do this super quick, the sun's path when it's at the Capricorn solstice or the Cancer solstice, in the northern hemisphere at the Cancer solstice, it gets about 23, 26 degrees north. And, because it's high above us. And at the Capricorn solstice, it's 23 degrees, 26 south by declination. And so that range is planets, when they're within that range, and that the path of the sun, of course, defines the ecliptic that we measure the zodiac and everything through. So when a planet gets outside of that range, it's sort of seen as being out of bounds. It's gone out of the range, the steady course set by the sun, it's broken out of that. Somebody that's done a lot of interesting work that probably some of you are very familiar with is Tony Howard. There's a really great way I've heard him describe this that I'll just share here, which is this idea of freedom, but the way he describes it, I think is really great. That instead of it being like a freedom, like, somebody's doing something to you and you're trying to react, like I gotta be free. It's like, it's just inherently free. Like you don't even think about it. It's not even reacting to something. It's just sort of the energy of doing whatever you want to do. Mercury out of bounds is also kind of connected to extremes, great heights. This one is actually, Mercury is out of bounds south right now. But what that means is we sort of have this, we're talking, I'm bringing up these ideas of these leaps of imagination. This right now with the square, it's literally like a leap. I mean, Mercury is out of bounds, stationing, squaring Neptune. So it's a very extreme Mercury and Sagittarius energy right now. And so if you have the space in your life to do something very creative and visionary, it is a good time to seize, to make some space the next few days and see what comes out of that process for you. Sorry, I gotta do this again. I don't know why my computer is doing this. Okay, so just quickly, the other thing happening with all this going on, because we have this extreme Mercury right now, we also have Venus opposite Uranus. And so an important thing about this Mercury retrograde is that it's sort of the final installment of the Venus retrograde. So even though Venus is stationing direct tomorrow, the same day that Mercury stations retrograde, Venus is still not going to be really moving. And so even though we're coming out of that Venus retrograde, it's going to take a little bit to start picking up speed again and moving forward again. And very importantly, this opposition between Venus and Uranus doesn't actually complete until the end of November. And Mercury is going to still be retrograde when this is happening. So this has been a very, very long, extended opposition between Venus and Uranus. It started back in mid-September. That was the first one at September 12th. Then on October 31st, there was a second one. And that was at the very beginning of Scorpio and Taurus. And that was right after about 5 days after Venus conjoined the sun at its inferior conjunction. So Venus was retrograde, had just been reborn at that one. And now we have another one coming up at the end of November. So really this entire time frame of the opening of the Mercury retrograde, we're dealing with Venus Uranus at the same time. And it's Venus again after having gone through this whole retrograde. So there's something here that's very liberating. It's sort of like what out of this entire Venus retrograde experience you've had for the past, since the beginning of October, really wants to come out of you. You know, it's because Uranus is involved, it needs to be something that really brings you alive, that's very authentic, that makes you really passionate, something that's very liberating. And so because this is such a big energy, this Venus-Uranus opposition, what I feel like the Mercury retrograde getting involved in all this is hopefully this Venus opposite Uranus energy is kind of making you aware of, this is something I really need to be this way in my relationship, or I want to create, I want to change. It could be something maybe creative you want to do. It doesn't have to be about a change in relationship if that relationship's been going fine and all that. But whatever it is that you really want to change and do something different, and there's bound to be something because of the Venus retrograde opposite Uranus. Now the Mercury retrograde is really taking you into what are all the visions and beliefs underlying the perceptions of this change. And because Neptune's involved, you know, there might be something about this change you want to do that may not be completely connected to your present reality in the best way. There might be something that needs to be adjusted. There might be something you're kind of fooling yourself about. There might be something kind of illusory about it. Whatever it is, or it could just be that you have this really exciting new thing you want to do. You want to put a bunch of imagination into it. That could work as well. But all these things are basically going on at the same time. A story that I don't have time to go into this whole story, but this is just an interesting thing I noticed. The Psyche and Eros story, if y'all are familiar with that. If you're not, you can look it up after this. It's a very old folktale. It shows up in this novel by Apuleius. It's a Hellenistic novel. It's one of the oldest novels that survives, at least in the Hellenistic era. And Psyche was born to she was like a princess. She was so beautiful that people thought she was sort of like the incarnation of Venus, to the point that people were worshiping her like she was Venus, and treating her as she was Venus. And Venus, the actual goddess, became enraged with jealousy. She sent her son Eros, or Cupid. She wanted him to kind of ruin the fortune of Psyche, but Eros, or Cupid, actually fell in love with Psyche. And she ends up getting whisked away, literally on the winds, to the palace, or like the castle of Cupid, or Eros. And if you're familiar with the story, you know that this castle where she ends up living at the beginning of the story is an incredibly archetypal world. It's made out of like gold and silver. It's said to, you know, it makes its own light. It doesn't even need the sun. It's described as being like a house of Jupiter. And there's all these voices talking to her. There's people just out of invisible helpers, you know, making these elaborate meals, choruses and musicians creating this beautiful music that's just in this sort of other world that she can't actually see. And Cupid, or Eros, comes to her every night, you know, and they make love and they fall in love with each other, but she can't see him. And he tells her she's not allowed to see him. If she tries to see him, everything will be ruined. It gets to the point where he tells her she's pregnant, and if she, you know, she's going to have this divine child as long as she continues to not try to look at him. But if she does, you know, it's just going to be a mortal child. Her sisters get involved, and they basically convince her to that he's some kind of monster. She needs to see who he is. And there's a famous scene where she hides this lamp she's actually holding a knife because she's afraid he is a monster. And she shines the light on him and discovers he's not a monster. He's actually this incredibly, you know, he's literally Eros himself, or Cupid, this incredibly beautiful god. And she is then basically expunged, and to make a long, you know, there ends up being all these, she gets separated from him. It's, you know, part of this is sort of the idea that you can't actually ever look directly at a god. But what ends up happening is Venus or Aphrodite gives her all of these tasks she has to do, which seem like they're impossible tasks. And she's incredibly grieving for losing her love to the point of being suicidal. But even every time she's thinking about suicide or giving these tasks, these other things around the world around her, sort of in the way you could think about like the living soul of the world that she's in, communicate to her. She actually meets Pan, the god of nature. She has ants talking to her and communicating with her. Even like towers are talking to her. Plants are, and they're all giving her advice and helping her. So there's a way that I can see this being, the way I'm bringing this up is because the asteroids are connected to the opening of this. And it's a very beautiful story that in a way talks about, there's definitely some things going on with this, with the idea of needing to shatter the illusion. And there's this great disillusioning experience and this great release of emotion. And, you know, it also brings in fears of abandonment and all these other things that I don't have time to go into right now. But because she really opens herself to this experience, and the fact that these other things in her environment, or these other aspects of just like her world around her, are communicating or helping her on this quest. She even at one point goes all the way down to the underworld, interacts with Persephone, gets this ointment from Persephone, and in the end, Eros, because she goes through all of this, Eros actually ends up coming to her, and they end up actually being actually able to be together, to the point where she, you know, it literally is a sacred marriage. They have this divine child. She really becomes divine, and so it's sort of like that original kind of perfect imaginal fantasy world she was in had to really get, she had to shine a light on it and kind of pop that illusion and then go through this underworld experience to come out on the other side of it, into this actual life that she actually in sacred marriage and all that. So the way the asteroids come into this is right now Mercury is pretty close to the Psyche asteroid. They've been close really for most of November. When Mercury is stationing at 13 degrees tomorrow, Psyche's at about 15 Sag. So they're pretty close together as it stations. And then interestingly, at the exact same time that Mercury stations, there's an Eros asteroid, and it is also stationing retrograde, and it's at 18 degrees. So if we bring in the Eros asteroid with the Mercury, there ends up being a mutable T-square because Neptune is in that same area. And during the Mercury retrograde, Neptune is actually going to station direct. And so there's a lot of different stories and myths you could kind of bring into this, but Psyche and Eros would be one of them. I don't know if it's okay, Linda, I'm assuming I can go over because I know I'm hit an hour, but I think it's okay for me to go a little bit.
Yes, definitely that, right? Go as long as you like.
Okay, cool. So the inferior conjunction that's coming up at the end of November, this is known as a sacred marriage also. So this is sort of like the sacred marriage that Mercury goes through during its synodic cycle, wherein it unites with the sun. You've probably heard before the term Cazimi, or being in the heart of the sun. A 6th or 7th century astrologer named Artorius is a text where this first shows up, and he talks about Mercury being with, or any planet actually, when it's within 1 degree of the sun, it's very much strengthened. Otherwise, when Mercury or any other planet like Jupiter right now is in that 15-degree range, it's kind of seen as going through this purification. So before, like between now and November 27th, it's sort of like we have this old Mercury that's kind of like, it's all this stuff is kind of like washing off of it. And Jupiter is actually going through the same thing right now. Jupiter and Mercury are both going through this together right now. And there's all this stuff of the past Mercury and Jupiter cycles we're kind of like washing off and purifying. Once the planet meets the sun, there's something germinated there. It's seeding the entire cycle to come. It's this reseeding of this new vision. And there's something clarifying and purifying about that. But we don't typically always, sort of like when you get like a new moon is another example of this. Every time the moon is conjunct the sun, it's basically the same idea with the moon. You know, it's not always clear then at that dark moon what is going to be the meaning of that next lunar cycle. You don't always know right then. And it's the same thing with this. So there's something sort of reseeded, and there's this new meaning that we're going to come into in the cycle ahead. And again, that's going to happen November 27th at about a little over 5 degrees of Sagittarius. The interesting thing is right before this, we get this Gemini full moon. So on November 22nd, if you're in Pacific time, or November 23rd, if you're in Eastern time or in Europe or somewhere else out in the Greenwich Universal Time Zone, we get this really pretty amazingly volatile Gemini full moon. So there's something really interesting about this full illumination of the lunar cycle that happens less than a week before Mercury is reborn. So Jupiter, you can see that on this, that the sun and Jupiter are pretty close together. They're within about 3 degrees. Because Jupiter's in its own sign, that's kind of known as it being in its chariot. It really actually holds up to the rays of the sun. So Jupiter is actually not so much impacted by this. But Mercury at this point is like 10 degrees away. It's getting close to being what's considered combust. And this is a point in Mercury, November 22nd next week. We're definitely in that putrefaction, purging, Negretto, Mercury retrograde process. And so it's very interesting that we get this full Gemini moon because, of course, Mercury rules Gemini. So this Mercury retrograde is ruling this Gemini moon. You can see that Mars is in Pisces, very closely squaring the Jupiter in Sagittarius, and Mercury is still pretty close. It's still about 3 degrees away from being in square to Neptune. And of course, it's a week later, and you can see Venus has barely moved. Venus is at this point at least starting to move forward, but we again still have a very strong Venus opposite Uranus squaring the lunar nodes. So this full moon, it's going to become, if it's not obvious already, what's really you're being really keyed in on this Mercury retrograde. This Gemini full moon is going to do it. It's going to be kind of like impossible to miss whatever the meaning is that you're supposed to be exploring and working on with this. The other thing is actually Neptune is stationing direct like 2 days later. So Neptune is stationing when this is happening too, which makes it much more intense because when any planet stations, as you know, it's really intensified. So we have this really intense Neptune right as this is happening. Then what happens just 2 days later, or actually 3 days later, about a couple of days later, is we get to Jupiter in the heart of the sun. So this is the moment that Jupiter is reborn. It happens to be the exact same day that Neptune stations direct. So this is a very interesting beginning to the cycle of Jupiter in Sagittarius. Even though Jupiter has already entered Sagittarius, this is a moment that Jupiter is really reborn in the heart of the sun. And the sun will now start separating away from Jupiter. And a little bit more, it's going to be kind of like mid-December that we will finally be able to see Jupiter again as a morning star. So this is the moment where, you know, you probably are already starting to get a sense of what this Jupiter and Sagittarius transit is going to be about, but this is where it's going to get a lot more clear. And it's very interesting that we have Mars and Neptune together in Pisces forming a square to this. So again, that to me brings up all the stuff I was already talking about this incredible imaginal potency to this, as well as the sort of stripping away of illusions to reorient yourself to more of a strong sense of inner truth. And then you can see on this too that Mercury is very close to the sun, but not quite there yet. So what we end up getting, and of course you can also look here, you know, you got Moon opposite Pluto, Moon's heading towards the North Node, the Venus-Uranus thing too, you know, squaring the nodes. You know, you can also bring in, we got Black Moon Lilith near Pluto, that's a true node of Black Moon Lilith, and Vesta's near the South Node. So a lot going on here. We then get the Mercury Cazimi, the inferior conjunction of Mercury, just a couple days later. So you can see this is happening at 5 degrees and 3 minutes. Interestingly, the moon at this point has entered Leo. So I really like that when we get this rebirth of Mercury, that the moon is in Leo forming a trine like that. I think is really nice. And you know, it's gone out of Cancer, it's gone a little bit away from the North Node, it's at least changed signs. We have that Uranus, you know, also in a fire sign with Eris, that's opposite Venus. So, I mean, this rebirth of Mercury is very potent. It's obviously with Jupiter. There's something incredibly visionary about this. But again, there's this, with that square to Neptune, it's just going to be important to, you know, pay attention. You certainly could have a lot of fun at this time if you're in a place just to have a lot of like creative exploration and just having a really good time. Like I could see how this could also line up with that. So again, obviously really just depends on what's going on in your situation, how you experience this. What's interesting is later, so the Mercury retrograde we have later next year, that's going to be in Pisces. What's interesting about that is that Mercury retrograde ends up stationing direct, conjoining Neptune in Pisces. And when it has its inferior conjunction, it's going to be actually squaring Jupiter. So instead of, you see in this one, Mercury is like squaring Neptune, it's with Jupiter. In the Mercury retrograde in Pisces, it's going to be connected to Neptune and squaring Jupiter. So there's a connection, an interesting connection with this one in Sagittarius to the next one that happens in March of 2019 in Pisces. So, and this is all going to be part of this Jupiter and Sagittarius story that we're going to be living through, which is very much going to be colored by the influence of Neptune and Pisces upon it. It's really the major aspect that Jupiter and Sagittarius is going to be making. So again, when this happened at the end of November, it's a time to really let yourself be open to what wants to come out of you. This is like the rebirth moment of the cycle. Typically, this is also a good day if you have some mercurial tasks to do. I do like trying to fit some of that stuff in on a day like this because typically they go a little bit better than at other points during the Mercury retrograde. But again, just really let yourself maybe get some time to meditate, do some inner reflection. I love the creative potential of this too. So it'll be a really amazing time to be doing anything creative or artistic. So the final piece of this is we get Mercury finally going back into Scorpio. So it's very nicely timed up with the calendar. So basically, we get into December, we go into the Scorpio phase. The first day of December, Mercury moves back into Scorpio. The second day of December, Venus re-enters Scorpio. So if you remember, Venus originally stationed retrograde in Scorpio, went back to Libra. Venus comes back into Scorpio. Ceres is already in Scorpio. So we end up then with Venus direct in Scorpio, Mercury retrograde in Scorpio. So there's something here where this is another piece of how Mercury is helping to tie up this Mercury retrograde. There's something very essential about it. And whatever lesson we've been going through with the Venus retrograde in Scorpio, during this phase, there's something that, you know, as Venus finally gets back into Scorpio, gets back to the degree that she had her inferior conjunction at, which is at the very beginning of Scorpio, we have Mercury retrograde in Scorpio. Interestingly, this is also when Mars and Pisces conjoins Neptune. And if you remember that Mars is the traditional ruler of Scorpio, there's a way that you can look at Mars is ruling Venus and Mercury retrograde at this point. So even though Mercury is leaving the sign squaring Neptune, it's being ruled by Mars that's joining Neptune. So this is again taking us right back into Neptune. But this time, instead of it being in Sagittarius, which is this visionary, you know, like optimistic, flying, you know, connecting up to spirit type of sign, you know, connected to Jupiter, Scorpio is pulling us down, right? It's really, we're going deep into the soul realm. And because Mars is connecting to Neptune, which is also basically roughly sextiling Pluto. And I know a lot of you would look at Pluto as ruling Scorpio. You could also look at this as Mercury retrograde is coming back to Scorpio and forming a sextile to Pluto and Capricorn. But this final phase of the Mercury retrograde is sort of like what is, to me, is sort of like whatever is getting stirred up by that whole opening part. This is the point where you have to basically just go into the heart of it and just penetrate deep into there's something underneath the surface. You know, Mercury in Scorpio has a much more probing, sort of investigative quality that's going to really kind of dig down and like get under stuff to see what's under there. So this is a much more kind of a deepening aspect of the transit. It then stations direct on December 6th, and then it starts moving forward again. At this point, it's become the morning star again. So we do have this is when Mercury becomes visible again in Scorpio as a morning star, and it'll end up being in Scorpio for roughly the first couple of weeks. December 12th, it'll go back into Sagittarius, and it'll actually be in Sagittarius for the rest of December, going through into January too, actually. So this is a chart of when Mercury actually stations direct. So interestingly, this happens right before the Sagittarius new moon at the dark of the moon. So basically right after this, I think like the next day or later this day, we get a new moon in Sagittarius. That new moon in Sagittarius is very interesting because it'll be the new moon that comes where we've like finally gotten on the other side of all of these retrogrades. And the sun is also finally getting away from Jupiter. So Jupiter will be becoming visible in the lunar cycle to follow this. You know, Venus is back in Scorpio. Venus will be moving towards the point where it's stationed retrograde. The Sagittarius new moon that comes on the other side of all of this will really be the sort of a very like restorative new moon to work with as far as setting intentions and really working with whatever has wanted to emerge from you out of all this. Looks like I maybe had a chat question. Not sure. Let me see. Okay. Yep. So the last thing I was going to do is, I don't know if Mandy is still here. Sorry it went over so long.
I am.
Okay, cool. So we're going to spend some time. Maybe we can do five or 10 minutes. I'm not sure. And Linda, just tell me if you need me to end it. Otherwise, I can keep this to five.
No,
10
look, you can
minutes.
go ahead. I will have to leave because I have to leave the house. Wanda, perhaps you
Okay.
could end the meeting. Okay, well, I'll just send Wanda a message. And so thank you very much, Gray. Yes, please continue.
Yeah.
But I do have to leave.
Okay.
So we'll catch you next time, okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and I can wind this up pretty soon. So Mandy's chart here is really fascinating in the context of all of this. Hopefully you all can keep in mind where a lot of the stuff was that I've been talking about, because her chart is completely connected to it. So you can see she has a Scorpio sun, which is basically, must have just been your birthday. So happy birthday. And Mercury is coming back to station retrograde eventually. So, you know, when we're on the other side of this, that in December, Mercury will be stationing direct pretty close to her sun, about 5 degrees away. You can see she actually has Mercury in Sagittarius, pretty close to the place where the inferior conjunction of Mercury is going to be. And she not only has Mercury in Sagittarius, she has Uranus and Jupiter and the south node of her moon and Neptune all in Sagittarius. So that, to me, that definitely counts as like a stellium, in my opinion. And the Mercury and Uranus in particular is very much at the heart of where this Mercury retrograde is going to be, as far as like the inferior conjunction happening. Very interestingly, the place where Mercury is right now and stationing retrograde is actually on her Jupiter. So this is a very dramatic Jupiter return to have all this going on, you know, just as she gets her Jupiter returning to the sign that she has Jupiter in. So that would be enough. But what makes it much more compelling, one is Chiron's in Gemini, opposite this. So, you know, we can bring Chiron and Gemini into, you know, Chiron's opposite Mercury, opposite Uranus. But she has a Pisces moon that is squaring her lunar nodes. It's squaring up at the northern bending. No, actually, it's at the southern bending. I'm sorry. And it's basically where Neptune and Pisces is. So it's pretty close. I mean, it's like 5 degrees away from where Neptune and Pisces is. You've probably already started getting Neptune getting a little close to your moon, but with Neptune stationing direct in this next month, it's going to be a shift towards Neptune moving forward again and starting to encroach and get a little bit closer to your moon, which is going to be a very big transit you'll be going through, with Neptune obviously squaring your lunar nodes and on your moon. So just like we were talking about, we're having this Mercury retrograde with it squaring Neptune. She has her moon configured into this with her Jupiter. She's been already having the transit of Neptune and Pisces squaring her Jupiter leading into this. So you're somebody, interestingly, that you've sort of had this foreshadowing precursor in your own life with your own transit of Neptune and Pisces squaring your Jupiter and Sagittarius leading into this. But certainly this is going to be like an intensification of that. And then, of course, she's Cancer rising. So her moon in Pisces actually rules the first house and is a really important planet to her. So anyway, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to just share about, like, what's been your experiences recently kind of leading into this, and then what do you think, what are you sensing is going on for you at the outset of this?
Well, I would say that I'm a musician, so
Okay.
I guess I've had a little bit of a writer's block recently, and just kind of struggling with my own creativity. And I kind of feel like with Neptune going direct and Mercury turning around, it might help me flip the script a little bit. That's just kind of how I've been viewing it, hopefully.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. That would be I mean, whatever you could do to just get yourself experimenting and going with it. But I do think this transit could be really creative. And it's certainly hitting your chart really strong. So yeah. What kind of?
It's a bit confusing, but I think that's the Neptune and Pisces stuff going on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Yeah, how have you felt? Besides writer's block, is there anything else you felt has been going on with the Neptune and Pisces transit so far? Because it would have obviously been. You've had this long extended thing where first it was squaring your Mercury, then it was like squaring your Uranus. Now it's squaring your Jupiter and your nodes and getting close to your moon.
I just feel like it's been unpredictable in every sense of the word. I mean, probably since my Saturn return, but definitely as Neptune gets close to my moon, it's just kind of like I'm a different person every year. So that's the energy I'm coming into this with. And I want to work with that because that's a very creative thing, to constantly be redefining what you believe and what you think, things like that.
Has there been anything like that you'd want to share about, like an example of?
Well, I mean,
trying to change.
even stumbling onto astrology. I mean, I think I put a lot of stock in my music career for a long time, and I've been studying astrology, and it's just become way more important to me lately. And that's been a creative outlet. New creative outlets, I think, which as I've defined myself through music, to start defining myself through a different creative outlet is just a big deal to me. I mean, I'm even painting, and that's not something I've ever done, so.
Yeah. Cool. So, what kind of music do you do?
I would call it Southern rock. I have a band called Love Rat.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And I feel the urge to, like, we just we're hiring a new drummer and things like that. So there are definitely changes there that might maybe spark that instead of feeling like I'm, am I a painter now? What am I doing? So it's cool.
Yeah. Well, it's a little hard to see exactly degrees on this chart, but I'm feeling like, do you basically have Pluto on your descendant?
Yeah, that conjunction between Saturn and Pluto is going to happen on my descendant degree.
Right on your descendant. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a good example of, plus, I mean, it's not just that, the lunar nodes are coming there. There's going to be some eclipses happening there. If you're familiar with like planetary nodes, it's like you've got your ascendant, descendant lined up. Looks like it's fairly close to, like, the ascendant's kind of like the north node of Pluto and Saturn. Your descendant's like the south node of Pluto and Saturn. So and this is such a big transit for everybody this next year. and especially it seems that way like in the United States, where we're living. So, but you're somebody that's going to obviously be hitting you on a very personal level with this. So kind of pulling, and that's already starting to take shape. I'm sure you've been having some Pluto experiences already. You'll be having a lot. You'll be having a lot more, I'm sure. But so then so that's definitely one thing to kind of keep in mind is like a bigger picture thing we can see going on the next year for you. But yeah, just pulling it back to what's actually going on right now. Interestingly, the whole Venus retrograde obviously hit your Saturn. Venus retrograde would have stationed on your Saturn, moved back and had its rebirth like right on your Pluto. And then during this Mercury retrograde, Venus is going to come back through again and hit your Pluto again, hit your Saturn again. And then obviously earlier in the year, we had that Mars retrograde that would have been squaring that point. So you've been really connected strongly to all this stuff that's been going on. So this Mercury retrograde in Sag, because you've got so many personal planets right there. Yeah, it seems like it's going to really kind of, the way that I would work with that is just letting yourself kind of just think, connecting with Mercury and Hermes, and this idea of being in between, letting yourself kind of move with what opens up to you in your creative process, trying to just let yourself fall, if it's painting or if it's singing, whatever it is, like try to just get yourself that creative space and let yourself really have the whole process to go through, because you're going to get hit by stuff on the others. Like for your chart, like there's so much going on with it. But yeah, I mean, as far as writer's block going on, there could very well be like something about how you've been doing stuff up until now that just isn't working anymore. And so maybe the writer's block is like a sign of that, for example, right? And it certainly doesn't mean you're gonna stop doing music or stop writing songs, but maybe there's some new, whatever. I don't know if that's the case. Like maybe there's a type of thing you were doing, and it's just not there for you anymore. Is that accurate at all?
That resonates. That completely resonates, because it's just, maybe that's why I've gone into other creative outlets, because I've been so unsure and probably holding on to what defined me instead of letting it go and trying something new in that area.
Yeah, and so it's not great to have writer's block. I mean, it's actually kind of a perfect thing to go into this with, because that's what this Mercury retrograde is really good for. With you at the very beginning stages of your Jupiter return, you can just kind of think about it as helping you just like break out of, maybe it's just like, oh, I thought I was supposed to be doing this, it's just not working for me. Just like kind of let that go, and just have being willing to let it go and see what else wants to come out for you. Because when Jupiter actually gets up to like 15 degrees, maybe you already know, but I have an ephemeris here. It's going to kind of look. I know Jupiter goes up to about 25 or so degrees when it stations retrograde next year, and it's going to come back, and so it'll end up stationing direct kind of near your Jupiter. Looks like it's kind of like mid-January that Jupiter gets exactly to your Jupiter. Yeah, Pluto is definitely right on your descendant then. But so I think that's just to kind of keep this down as far as the time we have right now. That would definitely be my advice, is kind of knowing that, so 2019 in January, you're getting Jupiter right there. There's typically with Jupiter returns, there becomes an opportunity for something, you know, for you to really take yourself to this other next level of something you want to work on. It seems like this is a really important part of your chart since it's right on your south node. Your moon squares it. So I was kind of wondering about it even being a place of like, sort of like creative power you even maybe like draw from with your art, and south node can often operate that way. And so yeah, just let this be a process of kind of discarding and clearing out, you know, what's not working anymore. And then like I was mentioning, really wait until the end of like November, you know, see what's ready to come out there in December, and then you know, December going into January, I would be imagining that there'd be a much more kind of like forward kind of energy coming out. That Mars Neptune conjunction coming together near your moon, there's definitely a lot of imaginal power available right there. Also,
it's gonna be awesome. Yay.
Yeah. So I think that'll be good. Yeah, but that's interesting. Yeah, in this case, I think like the writer's block, just kind of work with that, you know. And I mean, it's hard to get out of it, but just let yourself try to experiment with something. I would just say let yourself do something different.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, cool. Does anybody have any other questions? I don't know if anybody's on right now that can, if Wanda's even here or who's on to end the meeting, but if there's no other questions, I can definitely end it now. I can stop sharing too. I don't know who's on that does that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your chart. I can stop sharing now. I don't know is Wanda here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, cool.
Do you have any final closing thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, yeah, I think that example with Mandy was just a really good one as far as somebody that's engaged in creative processes and engaged in art and has been going through like a writer's block or something's like something about the way you've been doing things just not working as well. And that's really what we're going, that's always what I would recommend using with the Mercury retrogrades. And this one in particular, with it being out of bounds, with Jupiter involved, with it squaring Neptune, it's really like doing something out of the ordinary, just really breaking free of past patterns with this Venus-Uranus opposition happening at the same time. So I think that was a really good example chart. Obviously, it's hitting her chart very exactly, so it's more directly tapped into her. But even if you had a chart where it didn't seem so directly connected into it, I would kind of say the same thing. So yeah, thank you everybody for being here.
Okay, well that brings us to the end of the meeting. Would you all please thank Gray Crawford?
Thank you, Gray.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Always awesome.
Thanks, Sue.
Okay, all of you just X off, you know, when you're ready to leave, and we will see you next time, and have a happy Thanksgiving for all of you who celebrate it.
Yeah.